now that we've gone through that, it brings us to the next section of the video, going over the accusations and the actual crimes he's accused of. And we're gonna do this based on each character he's supposedly or very blatantly wronged. Because yes, there actually are some things he's guilty of. Objection! So plaintiff number 1 would be Roxy Migurdia. She's notable for being the first real example of Rudy's degenerate inclinations with an inclination toward women. His great offenses include peeping, theft of underwear, and grooming. So what do we know about Roxy at this time? Let's start there. Well, as a demon, a member of the Migurdia people, she lives longer than any human. She's roughly between the age of 20 and 30 by the time she first shows up at the Greyrat household, making her an adult. And she clearly has some sort of drive, as she herself would peep in on Paul and Zenith doing the do and would totally get off to it, by the way. Now, thanks to what seems to be a racial trait, as many of the Migurdia seem to look far younger than they are, her general body type is rather petite and lacking the usual seductive prowess of more buxom women. And this is where Rudy's most nefarious actions come into play. He notes that she's right at that perfect age where she's exactly his type. That's how he puts it. The exact wording is in the throes of puberty, so adolescence. Basically, Rudy is into these petite, small women who look young. And if you want to turn this into a height of consent argument over his preferred body type, well, I would suggest you don't. Roxy is both sexually mature and mentally able to support herself at this point, regardless of what Rudy thinks about her. Rudy's comments are not helpful to his case, but the accusations don't ultimately stack up to the behavior displayed. Sure, it's a trashy thing to say, but if we're trying people over things that they've said rather than things that they've actually done, our whole system of justice is then fucked. You actually have to prove he acted in some way to fulfill that strange desire other than the general perverted antics that he displays. Rudy would ultimately attempt to butter her up with otome game tactics, but if that constitutes grooming, then any guy who's ever sweet-talked a girl in his life is guilty. His only real offenses towards her are pretty much juvenile perversions like stealing her underwear and peeping on her. Both things that should be frowned upon, but nothing in there that actually comes with the negative inclination that he groomed Roxy, tried to sleep with her, or anything else. If your strongest argument for accusing Rudy of the crimes of grooming are just a few things he said in the story, then your argument doesn't really hold up, because ultimately his actions don't really reflect the allegations. The actual act of grooming involves an adult exploiting a minor, whether through coercion or manipulation, for sexual favors. Roxy being an adult and Rudy himself a child, as talked about earlier in this video, makes this impossible. But more than that, you have no actual proof that it was ever really a thing, other than him using otome game strategies to get close to her. And even if you want to say that Roxy telling Rudy to ask her again when he's an adult as a result of his attempts, I've got news for you. That's really just her deflecting so she doesn't have to hurt his feelings. This is a child asking her. She doesn't want to say no directly, so she's basically giving an impossible condition. Effectively, it comes down to he made comments about his preferred women, and people took that and ran with it. Rather than some malevolent manipulator seeking sexual pleasure, he comes off more as a bumbling idiot of a pervert chasing the thrills of something he's never experienced. I mean, some of his moves are just absolutely blatant in front of her, and she doesn't even bat an eye. Now, there is an actual, extra incident to be discussed here that isn't really a crime, since both parties involved consented to what happened, and both are actually adults when this happens. And this is the cheating allegations that we see at the end of Season 2, and what has ultimately fueled the grooming Roxy part of it. To quickly resolve some points, Sylphie gave her okay for this out of unconditional love for Rudy. She's not a victim in this. In spite of it being cheating, and even Rudy is viewing it as such, there's no victim, as Sylphie accepts the situation almost as if it doesn't matter much, and Rudy ends up with 2 wives. Unrealistic as it is, that's how the story played out. The real issue is that Rudy slept with her after already being married, and his behavior in that incident. There's no real good way to put it. He admits that he was terribly rough with her and it was her first time, so it wasn't exactly a pleasant experience. Just a casual note that Elena Elise warned her and kind of predicted that this would happen. So not exactly the sweet, tender moment Roxy had hoped for, but nonetheless a consensual one. Plus, we can also extract from this Roxy taking advantage of Rudeus during this broken state after everything that happened at the end of Season 2. In any case, we can pretty much dismiss the idea of her being groomed and talk about how he did some pervy things and had some nasty comments. In the case of Roxy Migurdia, 1 count of grooming, Rudeus is innocent, multiple counts of sexual harassment, definitely guilty, and 1 count of cheating on his wife, guilty. So that brings us to plaintiff number 2, the one that kind of gets him into the most trouble, Sylphie. And what do we have to unpack here? 1 allegation of grooming and a lot of storytelling. Now we'll just start with the damning part of this whole thing right out the bat, and that really puts Rudy on thin ice. He straight up has a debate with himself about turning Sylphie into his ideal woman while growing up together. I guess there's an argument where this could have been intended to mean something other than emotional manipulation or brainwashing, but it's pretty hard to see that without knowing what went on in the author's head when writing it. On surface level, this is a pretty bad look, at least without any additional context from the story. What I can say is some specific facts on this situation. Rudy does argue against himself, against the thought of making Sylphie his ideal bride. That is the exact quote. Ultimately, he does kind of lean towards doing it, but the conclusion that he executed on this plan remains unsupported. And that lends this whole situation to the interpretation of entertaining your darkest thoughts, but not actually ending up acting on them. In fact, this is the only time where Rudy shows any kind of manipulative inclination, and all their future interactions are framed as entirely wholesome and pure. It's also the only time he quote-unquote shows interest in Sylphie as a romantic or sexual partner. Other than that, it's nothing. Rudy sees her as a friend, someone he trusts and cares deeply for, as evidenced by his consideration of her in these things. You can actually find evidence of this in the story. Case in point, there's the issue of Rudy specifically not wanting any sort of physical relationship with Sylphie, nor even a romantic one, until they were of appropriate age. He openly acknowledges she's far too young to even understand the concept of that, and is content to simply have her as his friend for the time being. Effectively, it would be like taking an offhand comment from a character remarking that they wanted to kill someone and making an entire stance on that when it was really just an expression of their displeasure in the moment. There was a statement made, yes, but you have no follow-up action to prove he ultimately decided upon taking that course of action. Hell, just as much as you can headcanon in the fact that he actually did it, you can also headcanon in the fact that he ultimately decided not to. And well, we actually have more proof of the fact that he didn't than he did. Because if that were the case, the author would have given us some updates on how this was going. We would have seen some follow-up actions to support that conclusion, but we don't. There is another argument that people will make about Paul separating the two forcibly to stop Rudy from grooming her, but I think this is an entire misinterpretation of the situation yet again. From Paul's perspective, the 2 children were practically insular. They weren't the only children in the village by a long shot, and yet they were never seen with the others. Stack that on top of his existing worries due to Rudy never wanting to leave the house before meeting Roxy, and you can start to see the reason Paul wanted to separate them. His interpretation was that there was an unhealthy amount of codependence and that they'd become incapable of handling change in their lives in favor of each other and this insular little life they were building. His big fear was that they'd become emotionally dependent on each other and not be capable of relationships with other people. In addition, there was also the fear he had that Rudy would eventually grow bored of Sylphie and abandon her for another girl, specifically stemming from Paul's own nature, which would shatter the girl's entire life to pieces, as all she really had was her parents and her only friend, Rudeus. So really, it had nothing to do with any suspicion of grooming. It was about the dependence they had on each other. Paul wanted both of them to grow up emotionally healthy and capable of being independent in the case they ultimately walked separate paths in life. He was worried for Sylphie's state of mind, and he was worried that Rudy would go back to his more shut-in tendencies. If Rudy continued to do everything for Sylphie, she'd never be able to stand on her own. So it wasn't so much to protect her from Rudy that he separated them, but rather so that she could grow up to be a regular adult that wouldn't need to fear separation from her friend. And given the events of the story, that's some pretty good foresight. This still doesn't change that very dodgy conversation he had with himself, but the results are bunk if you want to talk about the supporting evidence for the grooming case, unless I can get direct confirmation from Ryufujin himself about what all that was supposed to mean. It would be like talking about robbing a bank, but never actually doing it, or better yet, contemplating a robbery and considering how it would be done, but then shelving the idea altogether and never acting on it. Ladies and gentlemen, is it a crime to think? But that being said, Rudy never really does much towards Sylphie until much later when they're reunited. And they're both adults by this world's standards when they meet again and eventually bang before settling down and getting married. And it's mostly her prompting for him to do so when it comes to the sex. Light novel and anime Rudy specifically expresses interest in developed women. He has some sleazy remarks about how he values youth and purity, the Roxy stuff, and later on when he says that being a virgin is out of attractiveness to his wife Sylphie. But he has his own line that he delineates by with the statement that he has no interest in prepubescent girls early in the story, when he states that he isn't interested in Sylphie like that at 6 years old, and even expresses concern for her well-being by responding that she isn't even ready for such a thing at that age. Yeah, Rudy specifically avoids that sort of relationship with Sylphie because he understands she's not ready for it. I feel like this kind of thing gets overlooked. Rudy was actually concerned about Sylphie's well-being and fitness for a relationship and drew a hard line at engaging in that kind of activity with her. Even in the bath scene, when he discovers that she's a girl and not a boy, there's nothing sexual going on there at all. It's all just shock that she isn't a boy. Even more proof that Rudy doesn't really have any interest in her sexually at that time. So whatever attraction he had was purely out of actual friendship and a desire for companionship for once in his life. All things in perspective, let's talk about the verdict. In the case of Sylphie, we can conclude that Rudy definitively did contemplate the path of turning Sylphie into his ideal bride, but ultimately never acts on it. We don't get any comments from Rudy about how it's going along, like, I've been making strides in brainwashing Sylphie, or she's gotten used to doing this or that, or I've shown her this sort of sexual act. The typical stuff you would expect to actually prove he did a thing. The story does not give you proof that he actually did it. In fact, it's almost treated as if it never happened. So you have to infer that he did based on a malevolent interpretation of the series of events surrounding that conversation with himself. So while it's not something you should have a conversation with yourself about, it's hardly equal to committing actual acts. So on this account of grooming Sylphie, Rudy is innocent. Not to mention the fact that the decade they spent apart from each other after Rudy is sent off to tutor Eris Greyrat. Speaking of whom, that brings us to our final plaintiff, Eris Greyrat. And this one is by far the worst example of Rudy's behavior because it's the clearest example of him being a sex pest. The charges are many accounts of sexual harassment and maybe a little sexual assault. From groping to making passes at the girl to outright trying to nab her panties while she's asleep in a barn. Yeah, there's no misunderstanding here. Like I said earlier in the video, Rudy is very clearly in a position where regardless of whether we consider him a child or an adult, he should clearly know better than to do these things. His treatment of Eris is by far his most blatantly repulsive behavior in my mind, but even then, there are some hard lines he never actually really crosses. So yeah, he's definitively guilty of groping Eris and trying to steal her panties. Unlike other allegations, we actually have recorded proof of these events. And retaliation for those events, where he gets the shit beaten out of him for them. So yeah, he deserves and gets punishment for that. In fact, I think there's hardly a Mushoku Tensei fan out there who thinks his behavior in these instances is justifiable or an acceptable way to behave. I've seen a few points made about these events. Like, Rudy's primary motivation in some of these cases was revenge for the beatings he would take from Eris, but that hardly makes it acceptable to grope a sleeping girl and try to steal her underwear off her. That's still sick and disgusting in its own right, but he wasn't trying to rape her, groom her, or anything else of that matter. In fact, the only time it came close to any intercourse before turning point 2 was when Eris's father tried to coerce her into making the first move. And Rudy accepted it, being the opportunist he is, but that never actually went through. Hell, he even immediately realizes that some of his actions in that situation were entirely wrong, that he shouldn't have acted on it, and felt immediate remorse for what he had done.
Everything Eris did today was for me. She worked so hard because she cares about my feelings, and I just ignored hers.
I'm the worst.
Rudy's actions can pretty much be classified more so as perverted than terribly evil. That doesn't make them good things or admirable traits, but it does show that he has certain lines he won't cross and certain things he absolutely is willing to do just because. By the time we get around to any sort of actual sexual intercourse between Rudy and Eris, she's an adult by her world's standards, and even the one to initiate it all because she feels desperate and lonely, and she's afraid that if she doesn't make Rudy a part of her family, he'll leave her. And that ultimately makes her the one doing anything criminal, because Rudy's actually still a minor at that point. So yeah, that's where the scum part comes from. I've never considered that fact to be in question. But again, the concept of Rudy being a controversial character and rather scummy figure has never once been in question. This pretty much strikes down the huge allegations that people like to lob against Rudy, that he's somehow a PDF file groomer. Now there's one more part to that allegation, namely a decanonized event from a deleted web novel chapter that details how he was spying on his niece in the bathroom in the first life. An objectively shitty thing to do in any case that I will not defend. If that had actually been a part of the mainline story, I wouldn't be making all these arguments, but it's decanonized. In fact, according to some people I've seen talk about it, it was never even a part of the original web novel and had nothing to do with Mushoku Tensei. People often act as though this were some damning piece of evidence, when in reality, it's been completely removed from the continuity altogether by the author. So again, it's not an actual event that happens in this story, yet it's something people will cling to as if it speaks volumes to this rendition of Rudy's character. And in one final note, while we have largely established that Rudy is technically a child, there's still the issue of treating his behavior in regards to his mental ability, and thus the need to go through and actually look at his crimes. Sure, he may be a child, but his behavior is not justifiable because he should know better. The issue becomes, how far do we take this line of thinking, because even in spite of legally being an adult in his past life, it's hard to qualify him as mature, considering he's a very stunted and underdeveloped individual mentally due to his experience in high school. The old Rudy became a person frozen in adolescence somewhere in the middle of his teen years because he couldn't move on from the hurt caused by his bullying. He's clearly a maladjusted individual. He was clearly socially deprived by his own volition. There's no doubt about the fact that the person Rudy used to be was a stunted, poorly socially adapted person whose behavior needed a lot of adjustment in order for him to fit into society. So him behaving this way was almost expected, considering in his last life this is how he thought life was, since his only view of it was through fiction. But that still doesn't really justify anything that he's done. And that is why I ultimately think the connection between his two lives is an important element, because if it really only exists in his memories, and his whole life and outlook is shaped by those memories, he ultimately isn't really considered an adult either way. I personally would judge Rudy as a young boy who should very well know better and could reasonably be expected to behave more maturely than he did throughout this story up until his academy arc. But trying to make him out as an adult feels wrong for many of the reasons that I've mentioned in part 1. I would actually put him mentally more in the category of a teenager, given how he was behaving in any given point up until the academy. He has his fair share of misdeeds and shortcomings in this life, particularly with Eris, but he's hardly the villain many want to make him out to be. So that brings us to the final part of this video. One of the most crucial parts that we need to address: the interpretation of all these events within the realm of fiction. And now there are two general issues with Mushoku Tensei when it comes to interpretation. And let's start with the first, and that is, what is the intention behind the creation of Rudy? Rudy was meant to be someone with a miraculous second chance at life, and someone wholly undeserving of it at that. He's immature, a failure of a human being, and all around repulsive to the point of his family kicking him out of his home. But the point behind his character is a simple message. People can change. And that's what makes his character compelling. He's able to recognize this and take advantage of this undeserved second chance. The fact is that most of what Rudy does is used to frame the character as a flawed individual. What many people don't seem to realize is that the story is not promoting this kind of behavior or telling the audience to mimic it. It is there simply to demonstrate that Rudy has flaws and things that he actually does need to fix about himself, and that there are areas where he can grow. It shows that when you refuse to take life seriously, when you refuse to try, and when you refuse to actively grow up and choose to actively wallow in your own self-pity, your life will inevitably deteriorate because life requires an active effort to maintain. But more than anything else, it really does show his immaturity. He's a child who thinks himself far more grown up than he is, yet he's prone to chasing his desires, retaliating against people in unfit ways because he fails to understand others, and overestimates himself because he's gotten on in life so well up to this point without really trying much. But that's ultimately the point of his story. Rudy is meant to make mistakes along the way because he is a terribly flawed person with a mountain of issues to overcome. As time goes on, he matures and becomes a much more grown-up and well-adjusted person. But he can't ever get there without stumbling over his own troubles and realizing where he falls short. He moves out of that phase of his life as he finally begins to understand just how much of a child he really is, in spite of the years of memories he has stored up in his head after losing his parents a second time. In this life, Rudy got a semi-normal life because he actually tried. It's not a story about redemption nor great heroics. It's a story about how someone can change. How even a person as broken as our nameless shut-in could ultimately be rehabilitated if given the chance. Rudy in his previous life was a man who never actually grew up. His whole tragic tale starts because he becomes complacent and doesn't make an effort. That lands him in a bad school, where he gets bullied and eventually faces humiliation that cripples him. And as a result of all of that, he gave up on ever trying to put in the effort to overcome it. Like I said, the whole point is that Rudy is someone who thinks he's an adult because he has a bunch of adult memories, but never actually acts like a full adult. He's standing on top all the memories of his past life, but even then the nameless shut-in was nothing more than a man-child who decided he was too afraid of everything to do anything with his life. He gave up, and as a result, his life stagnated. He ended up trapped in that juvenile state of mind. But that concept seems to make a lot of people uncomfortable. Thus, they struggle to really comprehend what the story is putting forward. It's been interpreted as enabling the worst parts of his personality, but if that were the case, why would he then change into something respectable, caring, and family-oriented? The exact opposite of all his worst qualities at the start of the story. The truth is that the story allows Rudy to fail without beating him over the head too harshly for doing so. I think there's a very good example of this with the two girls I've mentioned, one with Sylphie when he ripped her underwear off not knowing she was a girl, and one with Eris when he crossed the line she wasn't comfortable with. In both cases, he quickly realized he was wrong to do these things, and that he had hurt someone. He demonstrates remorse and a desire to try and make amends in both those cases as well. If the world were set up to enable his worst qualities, he'd never actually be in a position where he'd feel like that. He's not ignoring the lines altogether. He's simply got a skewed idea of where they are. And that presents a larger issue at play that has somewhat infected the anime community. An allergic reaction to anything that makes them uncomfortable. There are some people who seem to have it in their head that simply covering these concepts, that by having a character who wrestles with the idea of evil or does something that is morally wrong, that you inherently support such things as a fan or a creator. We've seen this happen to many series. Berserk being notable because it's gotten this treatment many times due to the fact that the Eclipse is a grotesque display of evil meant to mark Griffith as someone utterly unforgivable. Yet people continue to say that it somehow supports the actions that the literal villain of this story is depicted doing. Berserk doesn't show support for Griffith's actions. They're portrayed as evil. Yet, emotionally unstable people came across it, and rather than just not watching the show or reading the manga, decided to broadcast how evil it is to the internet for simply covering the idea of a villain doing something heinous and villainous. And here again we see it with jobless reincarnation. People have such an emotional reaction to things that they don't like to hear about that they automatically assume you support said thing if you decide to include it in the story. They fail to evaluate how the story treats those things and seem to think that it's unilaterally supporting those things just because it decides to talk about them. When it comes to jobless reincarnation, whether it be the sex stuff or the lack of action Rudy seems to take against the slave trade in his world, people seem to love misinterpreting this series as something that it isn't because it talks about something they end up having an emotional allergic reaction to. So, because jobless reincarnation shows that a pervert shut-in can become a well-adjusted family man who loves his wives and children, it must automatically condone all the negative behavior of its main character. We'll just casually have to forget the overarching trend of the story, the way in which it's all portrayed, and any other context surrounding it. Do you know what we call that? Cherry picking. What you are doing is taking one section of the story and manufacturing headcanon around it to support your conclusion, which is utterly insane, especially when it conflicts with what the story actually says and shows. You need proof of the action. You need to show something was actually done, not just words said. It is a fundamental failure to understand what a series of events means in a story in favor of an emotional reaction to a certain section of said story that appeals to your emotions strongly. Being too emotionally caught up in your own reaction to an event to fully analyze the situation and make a judgment on something based on actual facts makes you the problem, not the person or thing you're complaining about. And ultimately, authors are allowed to depict these things. Acts of evil are an important part of demonstrating how unredeemable a character is, or how villainous they really are, or how they struggle with certain issues, or how they try to overcome the sins of their past. When it comes to this conversation, a friend of the channel that I've had on, The Questioners, likes to mention Padan Thane from The Wheel of Time, an utterly reprehensible evil character who seems to relish in his vile actions. But to see that and say that The Wheel of Time implicitly condones everything he did would be insane! Starting down the road of trying to bar people from even discussing the issue of evil, or of having a protagonist who struggles with something, robs a story of any real meaningful moments. You stifle creativity and seek to destroy human expression when you clutch your pearls over something like this. Ultimately, it comes down to just how something is portrayed in a story that determines whether that portrayal is healthy or not. Jobless reincarnation is framed as some terrible, awful story that enables all of Rudy's most terrible qualities, yet his change in the story doesn't go from pervert to more of a pervert. It goes from pervert to a normal man with a family. If being a supportive family man is one of the worst qualities he has, then damn, I think your morals are fucking backwards. If fighting a god who nearly killed him in his first encounter just to save his family is a negative, bad value, then I think you're fucked in the head. This point of view that Rudy is evil because his past is spotted with mistakes and moral failings never takes into account the many more good things Rudy does with his life. The good things that ultimately pay off much more than any of the things derived from the worst parts of his personality. I can name a dozen things that Rudy does that stem from the best parts of him, that pay off far more than anything that seems to come from his more broken parts. In fact, it's the broken parts that hold him back the most, the worst parts of him that he ultimately abandons as he gets older. To then say that someone cannot possibly struggle with wrong and then correct themselves and live a redeemed life is, well, it's vindictive. And that reminds me of a comment made on my last Mushoku Tensei video. Quote, "Problem is, we live in an era of hyper-moralizing vindictiveness, drilled into people through the constant talk about victims and their plights. These people have no desire, nor ability to follow narratives about people who have committed certain wrongs in their eyes because they view those wrongs as unforgivable, and view narratives that explore improvement and redemption for such wrongdoings as either moral endorsements of those behaviors, or as having such a high standard for how to do that right in fiction that hardly any story that doesn't doom the wrongdoer to abject misery cannot reach their bar, usually because they're projecting their own past or prospective victimization onto the victims, real or imagined, of characters like Rudeus Greyrat. Plainly put, a generation of emotionally frail and terminally online people immediately draw a parallel between their own issue with sensitive topics and immediately extrapolate from shows like Mushoku Tensei that they're shows which trivialize their trauma, or that of a group they imagine has suffered relevant trauma, and take the side of those who inflict it rather than those who suffer from it. It's a very simple and black and white mindset in which the issues of the supposed victimizer is never considered nor deserving of empathy unless sufficient and serious punishment is doled out first. Of course, considering all the misery that Rudeus goes through, it should be apparent that to some, no amount of punishment will ever suffice. In all of this, Rudy is far from perfect, and far from a beacon of righteousness. Nobody is trying to argue he is, but he is an example of how someone with their own problems can ultimately turn their life around for the better. Reducing him to one of the worst kinds of sexual predators is a distortion of that fact. But if your aversion to the uncomfortable areas covered in this story pushes you to condemn him, then you haven't actually watched or read the story, because the actions you're condemning him of, his own story condemns.